The military depot was built in 1962 during the height of Cold War tensions. One of dozens of ammunition storage facilities constructed across rural America to support rapid mobilization in case of Soviet attack. Located 40 miles from the nearest town on federal land surrounded by forest, the facility consists of 20 concrete bunkers reinforced to withstand direct artillery strikes. Each bunker was designed to store thousands of weapons and millions of rounds of ammunition, ready for immediate deployment to military units if conflict erupted. The facility operated for 30 years, receiving regular shipments and conducting quarterly inventory inspections. The depot closed in 1991 as the Cold War ended and the military restructured its logistics network. Official records indicate that all weapons and ammunition were removed during decommissioning, transferred to active storage facilities, or designated for destruction according to standard procedures. The site was declared surplus property, with plans for eventual transfer to civilian use or sale to private buyers. But budget constraints and remote location made the property undesirable, and it remained federal land without active management or regular security patrols. Fences deteriorated, gates rusted, and the facility gradually disappeared from active oversight. What official records didn't reflect was that the decommissioning process was incomplete. Budget pressures and personnel shortages during the early 1990s military drawdown meant some facilities received less thorough final inventories than procedures required. Paperwork indicated full removal of all materials, but reality was different. 3 bunkers at the depot still contained substantial stocks of weapons and ammunition, overlooked during the rushed decommissioning process. Thousands of rifles, handguns, and associated ammunition sat undisturbed in climate-controlled concrete bunkers, forgotten by the bureaucracy that created them. For 28 years, the weapons remained in the sealed bunkers while the facility crumbled around them. The isolation protected them from casual discovery, and the site's designation as federal property discouraged trespassers who might face prosecution for entering restricted land. Occasional hunters passed through surrounding forests but avoided the obviously military facility. The weapons sat in darkness, preserved by the bunker's environmental controls that continued operating on emergency power from solar panels installed during the facility's active years. Discovery came in 2019 when a recreational drone pilot exploring remote areas captured aerial footage of the abandoned facility. The video showed deteriorating fences and rusted gates, making the site appear vulnerable to entry despite its federal designation. The pilot posted the footage online where it attracted attention from urban exploration enthusiasts who research abandoned properties. One viewer with military background recognized the facility type and realized that such installations often contained valuable salvage materials, including copper wiring and metal components worth stealing and reselling. A small group organized an expedition to explore the facility, arriving on a weekend with bolt cutters and tools to force open bunker doors. They expected to find empty concrete rooms, perhaps some abandoned office furniture or equipment worth salvaging. Instead, they discovered 3 bunkers still containing weapons racks filled with rifles, handguns stored in original crates, and ammunition in sealed containers. The discovery shocked them, and initial excitement about finding valuable items quickly gave way to recognition that they'd stumbled onto something potentially very valuable and definitely very illegal to possess without authorization. The group debated whether to report their discovery to authorities or attempt to profit from it. The weapons represented potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal market value, perhaps millions if they could find buyers. The remote location and obvious absence of security made the site seem safe to exploit. They ultimately decided to test the market, taking a dozen rifles during their first visit and making contact with individuals they knew who might be interested in purchasing weapons without documentation or background checks. The first sales happened quickly through connections in criminal networks that always seek weapons sources. Buyers asked few questions about the origins, focused primarily on functionality and price. The group sold the initial batch for premium prices because the weapons were military-grade and completely untraceable, lacking any serial numbers registered to current owners. Encouraged by the successful test sales, they began planning systematic exploitation of the forgotten stockpile. Recognizing they'd discovered an opportunity for substantial illegal profits. Over the next 18 months, the group made regular trips to the depot, gradually removing weapons and ammunition for sale through expanding distribution networks. They worked carefully to avoid detection, varying their routes to the facility, spacing out visits, and taking weapons in quantities that wouldn't be noticed if anyone somehow discovered the stockpile. They recruited additional members to help with transportation and sales, eventually creating a network of 12 individuals involved in various aspects of the operation, from removal to distribution to money laundering. The operation's scale grew as they gained confidence and developed reliable distribution channels. Initial sales of dozens of weapons expanded to hundreds as they connected with dealers operating in multiple states who could move large quantities. The group removed over 3,000 weapons from the depot over 18 months, distributing them across 9 states through criminal networks that sold to prohibited buyers, gang members, and individuals seeking untraceable firearms. The profits exceeded $2 million, split among core group members who couldn't believe their fortune in discovering such an abundant source. Federal authorities first became aware of the problem when weapons from the depot appeared at multiple crime scenes across different states. Forensic analysis showed the firearms shared similar characteristics. Military-grade specifications, manufacturing dates from the 1980s, no ownership records in federal databases, and similar storage wear patterns suggesting they came from the same source. ATF investigators noted the unusual pattern, recognizing that multiple crime guns sharing such specific characteristics suggested a common origin point that could indicate a significant trafficking operation. The investigation began with attempts to trace the weapons back through their chain of custody. Manufacturer records confirmed the weapons were military contracts from the 1980s, delivered to Department of Defense logistics centers for distribution to active units or storage at military depots. But records from that era proved incomplete due to database transitions during the 1990s, when the military modernized its inventory tracking systems. Many older records existed only on paper in archives, making comprehensive tracing extremely difficult and time-consuming. Investigators focused on finding where such weapons might have been stored and how they could have entered civilian circulation. They reviewed records of military depot closures during the 1990s drawdown, identifying dozens of facilities that were decommissioned during that period. Each facility supposedly underwent complete inventory removal, but investigators recognized that budget pressures and rushed timelines could have resulted in incomplete clearances. They began the massive task of physically inspecting closed depot sites to determine if any still contained forgotten weapons stocks. The breakthrough came when investigators interviewed someone arrested for illegal weapons sales, who mentioned his supplier obtained inventory from an old military place in the woods that he'd visited once to see the source. The seller couldn't provide exact location, but described the general area and facility characteristics. Investigators cross-referenced this information with depot closure records, identifying 3 candidate sites in the described region. Field teams deployed to inspect each location, finding 2 completely empty as records indicated, but the third matching the seller's description and showing signs of recent intrusion. Federal agents arrived at the depot to find obvious evidence of repeated unauthorized access. Fresh tire tracks led to bunkers with forced doors, empty weapons racks showed recent disturbance patterns, and ammunition containers had been opened and partially emptied. The agents realized they'd found the source of the crime guns, but arrived after extensive looting had already occurred. They immediately secured the site and began documenting what remained, discovering that 3 bunkers still contained over 1,000 weapons that hadn't yet been removed. The investigation shifted from source identification to network disruption. Agents worked backward from arrested sellers to identify their suppliers, using surveillance and financial analysis to map the distribution network. They identified the core group responsible for discovering and exploiting the depot, documenting their repeated visits through gate security footage from cameras they'd installed after finding the first evidence of intrusion. The investigation expanded to 9 states where weapons from the depot had appeared, requiring unprecedented coordination between federal and state law enforcement agencies. Surveillance teams tracked group members for 8 weeks, documenting their movements, communications, and connections to dealers who resold the stolen weapons. The group operated with surprising sophistication for criminals who stumbled into their opportunity accidentally. They used encrypted communications, varied their transportation methods, and structured their profits through multiple bank accounts to avoid detection. Their carefulness delayed, but couldn't prevent their identification once investigators focused specifically on tracing the depot weapons. The investigation revealed the massive scale of what the group had already distributed. Forensic analysis of weapons recovered from crime scenes suggested over 3,000 had entered circulation from the depot stocks. Additional weapons presumably remained in circulation, but hadn't yet been recovered or traced. The group's systematic exploitation over 18 months put military-grade weapons into criminal networks across multiple states, with some weapons traveling through multiple resales to end users far from the original distribution points. Federal prosecutors worked with investigators to plan a comprehensive takedown operation targeting all 12 network members and the dealers who purchased directly from them. The goal was simultaneous arrests across 9 states to prevent warnings from spreading and giving suspects opportunity to flee or destroy evidence. Legal teams prepared warrants for over 30 locations, including residences, storage units, and dealer premises. Tactical teams rehearsed procedures for executing raids in multiple jurisdictions on the same morning. The operation launched at dawn on a Wednesday. Federal agents and state police executed arrests and search warrants simultaneously across 9 states. The core group members were arrested at their homes, caught before they could respond to news of the operation. Dealers who purchased from them faced raids that seized weapons, records, and financial documents. The coordinated operation netted all 12 core members and 18 dealers within 6 hours, with only 2 suspects initially eluding capture before being arrested within 48 hours. Evidence seized during the raids provided comprehensive documentation of the operation. Agents recovered over 800 weapons that hadn't yet been resold, financial records showing over $2 million in proceeds, communications coordinating depot visits and sales, and photographs the group had taken of the bunkers showing the stockpiles they discovered. Several group members had kept detailed records of their activities, apparently out of pride in their discovered opportunity and desire to document their criminal success for posterity. The depot itself became the focus of massive recovery and security operations. Military personnel and federal agents spent 6 weeks removing all remaining weapons and ammunition, documenting everything for evidence and to verify nothing remained that could be looted again. Engineers examined the bunkers to determine how weapons had survived undetected for decades, finding that the environmental control systems had operated automatically on solar power, preserving the weapons in near-perfect condition. The facility was then demolished to prevent any future use, with bunkers filled with concrete and the entire site cleared to ground level. Media coverage of the case shocked the public and embarrassed military and civilian officials responsible for depot decommissioning. The revelation that thousands of military weapons sat forgotten in bunkers for decades then entered criminal circulation, represented a spectacular failure of inventory control and facility management. Congressional hearings demanded explanations for how such weapons could be overlooked during decommissioning and why the depot remained unsecured for decades after closure. Military officials testified that the incomplete decommissioning resulted from budget pressures and personnel shortages during the 1990s drawdown. Procedures required complete inventory removal, but rushed timelines and inadequate staffing meant some facilities didn't receive thorough final inspections. The depot fell through bureaucratic cracks, with no agency taking responsibility for ongoing security after closure. The testimony prompted calls for comprehensive review of all closed military facilities to ensure no similar forgotten stockpiles exist at other locations. Federal agencies launched nationwide audits of closed military depots, inspecting over 100 facilities to verify complete clearance. The audits discovered 3 additional locations with small quantities of forgotten ammunition, though no other sites contained weapons on the scale of the original depot. The findings prompted immediate remediation and implementation of new protocols requiring regular inspections of all closed military property, regardless of presumed decommissioning completion. The criminal trials began 11 months after the arrests. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including the weapons themselves, surveillance footage of depot visits, financial records showing illegal proceeds, and testimony from cooperating defendants who provided detailed accounts of the operation. Defense attorneys struggled against the weight of evidence, with some arguing their clients didn't know the weapons originated from military stocks, an argument prosecutors easily countered by showing the defendants discussed the depot origin in recorded communications. The core group members who discovered the depot and organized the looting operation received the harshest sentences. The original discoverers were sentenced to 18 and 20 years, respectively, reflecting their leadership roles in organizing and executing the systematic theft. Other group members received sentences ranging from 10 to 15 years, depending on their involvement level. The sentences reflected the serious nature of putting thousands of military weapons into criminal circulation and the extensive harm resulting from crimes committed with those weapons. Dealers who purchased from the group received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. Those who knew the weapons originated from military stocks received enhanced sentences. Others who claimed ignorance of the source received somewhat reduced terms, but still faced substantial prison time for dealing in weapons they knew were illegal to possess and sell. All lost their licenses if they were previously legitimate dealers, and faced asset forfeiture of property purchased with illegal proceeds. Victims of crimes committed with weapons from the depot attended sentencing hearings, describing how violence enabled by the stolen military weapons devastated their families. Over 40 serious crimes had been linked to depot weapons by the time of sentencing, including 12 homicides, 23 assaults, and numerous armed robberies. Prosecutors argued that the defendants bore responsibility for enabling all this violence through their systematic theft and distribution of military weapons, making maximum sentences appropriate. Civil litigation followed the criminal cases as victims sued the federal government for negligent facility management that allowed the weapons theft. The cases raised complex questions about government liability when weapons from improperly secured military property caused civilian harm. Several cases settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, while others were dismissed on sovereign immunity grounds. The litigation continued for years, with some cases reaching federal appellate courts on liability questions. The investigation revealed that several hundred depot weapons remained unaccounted for in criminal circulation. Federal agents continued tracing weapons as they appeared at crime scenes or got recovered during other investigations. Each recovery provided additional evidence linking back to the original theft, and sometimes led to arrests of individuals who purchased the weapons downstream from the original distribution network. The effort to recover all stolen weapons became an ongoing mission requiring sustained resources. Financial recovery efforts focused on seizing assets purchased with the illegal proceeds. Group members had invested profits in real estate, vehicles, businesses, and luxury items. Asset forfeiture proceedings recovered over $1 million in property and cash. Though substantial proceeds remained hidden in accounts that investigators couldn't definitively link to the illegal operation. The recovered funds were distributed to victims and used to offset investigation costs. The case prompted comprehensive reforms in how the military manages facility closures and maintains oversight of decommissioned property. New regulations require independent verification of complete inventory removal before any facility can be designated as fully decommissioned. Closed facilities must receive quarterly security inspections until officially transferred or sold. The military created a dedicated office responsible for tracking all closed depot sites and ensuring none fall into neglected status that could enable theft or unauthorized access. Congress appropriated additional funding specifically for comprehensive audits of all former military storage facilities. The multi-year project aims to verify the status of every depot closed since 1990, physically inspect all bunkers and storage areas, and ensure no additional forgotten stockpiles exist. Early results from the ongoing audits have identified several locations requiring additional security measures and a few cases of small quantities of forgotten materials requiring proper disposal. For the communities where depot weapons enabled violence, the case created lasting impacts on perceptions of government competence and responsibility. Residents whose neighborhoods experienced violence from military weapons stolen due to inadequate facility security expressed anger at the bureaucratic failures that created the situation. Local officials demanded assurances that no other forgotten military stockpiles exist in their regions, seeking to prevent any repetition of the nightmare created by the depot theft. The urban exploration community faced scrutiny after the case revealed how the depot discovery originated from drone footage posted online. Some jurisdictions enacted restrictions on drone flights over federal property, and criminal trespass laws were strengthened to cover unauthorized entry onto closed military facilities. The exploration community itself developed ethical guidelines discouraging members from entering secured government property and encouraging reporting of any discoveries that might represent safety or security concerns. 3 years after the initial arrests, the investigation continued as agents traced weapons through extended distribution chains. Some depot weapons had been resold multiple times, traveling through criminal networks spanning the country. Each trace required extensive investigation, and some weapons would likely never be recovered because they'd entered international trafficking networks or were destroyed after use in crimes. The full impact of the depot theft would never be completely quantified. For federal investigators, the case demonstrated vulnerabilities in how government manages legacy facilities and infrastructure. The depot weapons sat forgotten for decades because no agency maintained responsibility for ongoing oversight after closure. Similar vulnerabilities potentially exist for other types of facilities and materials that could be exploited if discovered by individuals willing to commit crimes. The case emphasized the importance of comprehensive asset management and sustained oversight even for properties designated as closed or inactive. The environmental controls that preserved the weapons in perfect condition for decades became a case study in unintended consequences of good engineering. The solar-powered systems were designed to protect military equipment in the event of grid failures during conflict. They succeeded so well that weapons remained viable for decades after the facility closed, creating the very vulnerability the security measures were supposed to prevent. The case prompted review of how environmental systems get designed and whether automatic shutdowns should be incorporated for decommissioned facilities. 5 years after the arrests, the last appeals in the criminal cases were exhausted and all convictions became final. The group members who discovered the depot and organized the theft operation were serving long sentences with projected release dates in the late 2030s. The case remained a prominent example of how forgotten government assets can become sources of criminal opportunity if not properly managed. It appeared in training materials for military logistics personnel, federal facility managers, and law enforcement investigators. The demolished depot site remained federal property with no immediate plans for alternative use. The remote location and association with the massive weapons theft made it undesirable for sale or transfer. Nature gradually reclaimed the cleared land, with vegetation covering the scars left by the demolition. The site stood as a physical reminder of bureaucratic failures and the consequences of inadequate oversight, though only those who knew the history recognized the significance of the unremarkable forest clearing. For the families affected by violence committed with depot weapons, the conclusion of criminal cases provided some closure, but couldn't undo the harm. The knowledge that their loved ones were attacked with weapons stolen from poorly secured military property added another layer of tragedy to their losses. Some found limited comfort in knowing the responsible parties faced justice and that reforms were implemented to prevent repetition. Others remained angry that such gross negligence enabled the violence that devastated their lives. The story concludes with recognition that protecting forgotten assets requires sustained effort and resources. The depot weapons remained undiscovered for decades because no system existed to maintain awareness and oversight of closed facilities. But once the theft was detected, comprehensive investigation and prosecution brought those responsible to justice. The balance between efficiently managing vast government properties and maintaining security over all assets, even those designated as inactive, remains an ongoing challenge requiring sustained commitment. Vigilance over all government assets, even those considered closed or inactive, remains essential. The depot case demonstrated that forgotten materials can become criminal opportunities if oversight lapses. The reforms implemented after the case aim to prevent similar failures, but only sustained commitment to comprehensive asset management and regular inspections will ensure no other forgotten stockpiles exist waiting to be discovered by those willing to exploit them for profit.